We're going to begin our discussion of epistemic injustice by focusing on Miranda Fricker's work on testimonial and hermeneutical injustice. So there's this quote that we should keep in mind that she starts out her chapter on testimonial injustice with: "There's female intuition and there are facts." We'll be returning to this claim in the short future here. Okay, to start out, we should have a conception of power, or at least Fricker suggests various ways of thinking about power. So social power is the capacity that we have as social agents to influence how things go in the social world. Now, this can be active. So when power is actually used, like when a traffic warden issues a parking violation, that's an active use of social power. But it can also be passive. So the power isn't actively used, but its influence is still felt and still has the product of getting people to do something. So like when a traffic warden doesn't hand out a violation, but the fact that they would or could compels you not to violate parking laws. So power or social power is a capacity. It's a capacity that one has. Just because you don't use it doesn't mean you don't have it. Its existence is not dependent on its actuality or it being actually manifested. So this is a theoretical disagreement that she has with Michel Foucault. Okay, so there's agential power. So that's the case like with the traffic warden, right? Power that one wields as a person to another person. That's power employed by an agent or an actor. And then there's structural power, and this is the one that she's going to be more interested in. And this is power that's exerted over individuals such that there's no one person exercising it. So this is like when a group of people collectively don't vote. So maybe Confederate statues enforce structural power. They are reminders of the deep racial prejudice in a particular locality for Black folks. And so it has this kind of structural effect. It can also happen by virtue of the way that different institutions are set up and so on. Now, it's important to recognize that agential power is nearly almost always also structural power. So we always exert agential power in a context of some functioning social world. So for example, my role as an educator, that allows me to exert power over students only because there's a shared social structure such that maybe, let's say, employers and others will only take your grades seriously because they respect my judgment. So the reason why I can have this agential power over students' grades is because of this other broader network of interlacing power relations that we all occupy. Now, the point of power or social power is to exert social control. So there's always some social group that is properly described as being controlled, even while that control has no particular agent behind it, even if it's structural. So for example, with the birth of the delinquent, quote unquote, a certain subject position is created in this network of power relations as the subject matter for a certain, say, professionalized theoretical discourse. With the disenfranchisement of that given social group, the interests of that group become politically expendable. So for example, becoming a felon then deprives you of certain kinds of respect that you otherwise would have as a citizen in the United States. So you can't vote, for example. So social power can be restated: a practically socially situated capacity to control another's actions, where this capacity may be exercised either actively or passively by particular social agents, or alternatively, it may operate purely structurally. And that's really a summary from the different things that we've talked about here. So for the purposes of testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice, Fricker is going to be interested in what's called identity power, or what she labels as identity power. So some operations of social power are, quote, dependent upon agents having shared conceptions of social identity, conceptions alive in the collective social imagination that govern, for instance, what it is or means to be a woman or a man, what it is or means to be gay or straight, young or old, and so on. So this is identity power. It can be exercised actively or passively. In the quote above, this one, Greenleaf silences Marge by exercising identity power. The identity power he inevitably has as a man over her as a woman. And he does this by invoking a collective conception of femininity as insufficiently rational because it's excessively intuitive. In other cases, the man might not have to actually do anything. So this is a case where it's active, but it could be passive. It could be that there's just a collective identity ascription that women should never pitch their word against a man, in which case such power would be wielded passively. For identity power to function, there must be a shared imagined conception. So both parties must share in this relevant collective conception of what it is to be, in our case, a man or a woman. This can be true even if one doesn't subscribe to those conceptions as being fair, accurate, or just. So as a woman, I can just deny that my intuition doesn't account for anything. Nevertheless, I know that that is at play in our broader social context. And me knowing that that's the case, that's how my interlocutor will receive me, that might be enough to exist to silence me in the expression of my view. So this can happen purely structurally too. So an example of a purely structural identity power. So this might happen when someone has an idea of oneself as, say, the kind of group or thing that votes or engages politically, or alternatively as the kind of thing or people who, quote, aren't political. So this common collective understanding can then influence one not to participate in social power more generally. So it doesn't have to be agential. Identity power can also be structural. Okay, so now we're in a better place to get at what's going on with testimonial injustice. So identity power is a crucial element in the exchange of information. People are awarded credibility excesses and deficits by virtue of the kind of identities that they have and the shared collective significance that those identities carry. So these differentials in credibility are not themselves a problem, right? There are many cases where individual opinions should carry greater weight. For example, health experts on the effectiveness of masks for preventing the spread of communicable diseases. Those health experts have credibility, more so than some other individuals, and they should carry extra weight. But the kind of thing that we're concerned with in testimonial injustice is whether someone has been awarded too much credibility or too little credibility by virtue of their social status or identity. So there's this sense in which there are cases where someone's credibility is baked into one's identity, and these cases are going to be unjust. And really, like, two things can go wrong here. One, you'll either fail to satisfy an epistemic duty as an interlocutor with them. And what that means, epistemic just means concerning knowledge, right? So a duty that you have with respect to knowledge acquisition. So you'll miss out on some piece of knowledge that you should take seriously. We generally think that we're subject to certain kinds of epistemic duties, certainly in the academic world. That's why we have students look for sources, look towards experts, study the material that they're talking about, because we think that you have an epistemic duty to learn about these things to be able to talk about them with credibility. Okay, so you might fail to satisfy an epistemic duty towards truth or something, or you might erroneously deflate or conflate someone's standing as a knower and deprive them of the status that they are due. And the idea here is that one important capacity of us as humans, as persons, is our capacity to know things. This is a core element of who we are as people. And so to deprive someone of that status is to disrespect them in some way. And insofar as you're disrespecting them as a knower, you're disrespecting them as a person. And so that would be a moral wrong. Now, we're not talking about cases where someone has erroneously denied someone their status as a knower because they have a false belief. So, for example, she gives an example of the general practitioner of thinking of the general practitioner, a doctor, general practitioner doctor, as erroneously giving them too much credibility for knowing what to do as for some particular healthcare issue. Or maybe through some innocent error about who we think someone is, right? So let's say we Google someone and we mislabel what their title is because it was just a horrible, wildly unfortunate Google search. And so when we're talking with that person, we downplay their credibility when we actually shouldn't be because we've mistaken what their credentials are. Now, we're not talking about those kinds of cases. What we're interested in is a particular type of denying someone's status as a knower that is grounded in prejudice. So she gives a case of the example from To Kill a Mockingbird. In To Kill a Mockingbird, a black man, Tom Robinson, is on trial for raping a white girl, Mayella Ewell. It's obvious in the story that the man's innocent. The trial is really about the power of evidence versus the power of racial prejudice. In the story, the all-white jury succumbs to the racial prejudice. So throughout the court proceeding, the testimony offered by Tom Robinson in the context of white supremacy is grounds for the deflation of his capacity as a knower. Atticus Finch, Robinson's lawyer, presses the jury to do what's their epistemic duty, to believe Tom Robinson. So here's the case, right? From the reading, Mr. Gilmer, the prosecutor, sets Tom Robinson up. Why were you so anxious to do that woman's chores? Tom Robinson hesitated, searching for an answer. Looked like she didn't have nobody to help her, like I says. Mr. Gilmer smiled grimly at the jury. You're a mighty good fellow, it seems. Did all this for not 1 penny? Yes, sir. I felt right sorry for her. She seemed to try more than the rest of 'em. You felt sorry for her? You felt sorry for her. Mr. Gilmer seemed ready to rise to the ceiling. The witness realized his mistake and shifted uncomfortably in the chair. But the damage was done. Below us, nobody liked Tom Robinson's answer. Mr. Gilmer paused a long time to let it sink in. So here, the damage in question is done to any epistemic trust that the white jury has so far been human enough to feel towards the black testifier. For the feeling sorry for someone is a taboo sentiment if you are black and the object of your sympathy is a white person. In the context of a racist ideology structured around dogmas of white superiority, the fundamental ethical sentiment of plain human sympathy becomes disfigured in the eyes of whites, so that it appears as little more than an indicator of self-perceived advantage on the part of the black subject. A black man is not allowed to have feelings that imply any position of any sort of advantage relative to any white person, no matter how difficult and lonely her life might be. The fact that Tom Robinson makes the sentiment public raises the stakes in a way that is disastrous for legal justice and for the epistemic justice on which it depends. The trial is a zero-sum contest between the word of a black man against that of a white girl, or perhaps that of her father who has brought the case to court. And there are those on the jury for whom the idea that the black man is to be epistemically trusted and the white girl distrusted is virtually a psychological impossibility. Robinson's expressed sympathy in feeling sorry for a white girl only reinforces that impossibility. So throughout this court proceeding, the testimony by Tom Robinson in the context of this white supremacy is grounds for the deflation of his capacity as a knower. Atticus Finch, Robinson's lawyer, presses the jury to do what is their epistemic duty, to believe Tom Robinson. But they don't because of this feature of their identity, Tom Robinson's being black. Now, this distrust of black folks is not just done in the most hateful, prejudicial ideologies, but also in the more domestic, stereotypical ideas that are almost cozy in comparison. Robinson's case is one of prejudicial credibility deficit. Now, more broadly speaking, prejudicial credibility deficits can be incidental. So she gives an example of a panel of referees on a science journal that might have a dogmatic prejudice against a certain research method and deny someone's status as a knower on the grounds that they use that method. But it can also be structural, and these are produced by prejudices that track the subject through different dimensions of social activity: economic, educational, professional, sexual, legal, political, religious, etc. Blackness is one of these. Being a woman is one of these. Being lower class is one of these. The main kinds of identity tracking prejudices are social identities. And so someone would be subject to a testimonial injustice if by virtue of having that identity, their capacity as knowers is deflated. Or for someone having a privileged identity, being white, being a man, etc., heterosexual, so on, upper class, that their identity being that gives them a credibility surplus. And if you look at some of the supplemental readings that I have here, there's one on the Blasey Ford and Kavanaugh testimonies that lends a kind of example of an analysis that can run this direction, where the idea is that Kavanaugh is given a kind of unjustified credibility by virtue of certain social identities that he carries, and Blasey Ford is given a deficit. So that's testimonial injustice, and it's generally a person-to-person thing. It's generally done when someone is hearing someone else's testimony. And then there's hermeneutical injustice. And just quickly, for our purposes, hermeneutical can be about or concerned with the general interpretations that we have as in a society for certain phenomena or states of affairs. Access to the mechanisms that produce knowledge that we then draw on to make sense of our own experience and the experiences of others and the world around us. So the dominated live in a world structured by others for their purposes. Purposes that at the very least are not our own and that are in various degrees inimical to our development and our existence. So this is a quote that she pulls from. She says there's a couple different ways we can understand this. Materially, it could be that social institutions and practices favor the powerful. It could be ontological or about existence. The powerful might constitute the social world. Or it could be epistemically read, and that's the way we're going to look at it. The powerful have an unfair advantage in structuring collective social understandings. We're somewhat already familiar with this idea with cultural imperialism back when we discussed Jung, but this is the one that we're talking about today. So here's a nice quote. Our shared understandings reflect the perspectives of different social groups. Relations of unequal power can skew shared hermeneutical resources so that the powerful tend to have appropriate understandings of their experiences ready to draw on as they make sense of their social experiences, whereas the powerless are more likely to find themselves having social experiences through a glass darkly, with at best ill-fitting meanings to draw on in the effort to render them intelligible. And I'm going to go to these pages to look at the examples she offered. So let us first briefly revisit one woman's account in the late 60s of a university workshop on women's medical and sexual issues, as relayed by Susan Brownmiller in her memoir of the U.S. Women's Liberation Movement. Wendy Sanford, born into an upper-class Republican family, was battling depression after the birth of her son. Her friend Esther Rome, a follower of Jewish Orthodox traditions, dragged her to the second MIT session. Wendy had kept her distance from political groups. I walked into this lounge, she recalls, and they were talking about masturbation. I didn't say a word. I was shocked. I was fascinated. At a later session, someone gave a breastfeeding demonstration. That didn't shock me. But then we broke down into small groups. I had never broken down into a small group in my life. In my group, people started talking about postpartum depression. In that 45-minute period, I realized that what I'd been blaming myself for and what my husband had blamed me for wasn't my personal deficiency. It was a combination of psychological things and a real societal thing, isolation. That realization was one of those moments that makes you a feminist forever. So in this case, we see a place where women were together looking for a proper understanding of what now we might easily name as postnatal depression. But in the hermeneutical darkness at that time, it was inaccessible, but then was able to be suddenly lifted from Wendy Sanford's mind, given that she was wrongfully prevented from understanding a significant area of her social experience, and thus depriving her of an important patch of self-understanding. So if we can substantiate this intuition, then we'll see that the area of hermeneutical gloom with which she had lived up until that life-changing 45 minutes constituted a wrong done to her in her capacity as a knower, and was thus a specific sort of epistemic injustice, a hermeneutical injustice. So let's look at another case with sexual harassment here. One afternoon, a former university employee sought out Lynn Farley to ask for her help. Carmita Wood, age 44, born and raised in the apple orchard region of Lake Cayuga, and the sole support of 2 of her children, had worked for 8 years in Cornell's Department of Nuclear Physics, advancing from lab assistant to a desk job handling administrative chores. Wood did not know why she had been singled out, or indeed if she had been singled out, but a distinguished professor seemed unable to keep his hands off her. As Wood told the story, the eminent man would jiggle his crotch when he stood near her desk and looked at his mail, or he'd deliberately brush against her breasts while reaching for some papers. One night, as the lab workers were leaving their annual Christmas party, he cornered her in the elevator and planted some unwanted kisses on her mouth. After the Christmas party incident, Carmita Wood went out of her way to use the stairs in the lab in order to avoid a repeat encounter. But the stress of the furtive molestations and her efforts to keep the scientist at a distance while maintaining cordial relations with his wife, whom she liked, brought on a host of physical symptoms. Wood developed chronic back and neck pains. Her right thumb tingled and grew numb. She requested a transfer to another department, and when it didn't come through, she quit. She walked out the door and went to Florida for some rest and recuperation. Upon her return, she applied for unemployment insurance. When the claims investigator asked why she left her job after 8 years, Wood was at a loss to describe the hateful episodes. She was ashamed and embarrassed. Under prodding, the blank on the form needed to be filled in. She answered that her reasons had been personal. Her claim for unemployment benefits was denied. Lynn's students had been talking in her seminar about the unwanted sexual advances they had encountered on their summer jobs, Savine relates. And then Carmita Wood comes in and tells Lynn her story. We realized that, to a person, every one of us, the women on staff, Carmita, the students, had had an experience like this at some point. And none of us had ever told anyone before. It was one of those click aha moments, a profound revelation. The women had their issue. Meyer located 2 feminist lawyers in Syracuse, Susan Horn and Maury Hines, to take on Carmita Wood's unemployment insurance appeal. And then, Savine reports, we decided that we also had to hold a speak out in order to break the silence about this. The this they were going to break the silence about had no name. 8 of us were sitting in an office of human affairs, brainstorming about what we were going to write on the posters for our speak out. We were referring to it as sexual intimidation, sexual coercion, sexual exploitation on the job. None of those names seemed quite right. We wanted something that embraced a whole range of subtle and unsubtle, persistent behaviors. Someone came up with harassment, sexual harassment. Instantly we agreed that's what it was. So in that case, women didn't have a word for the practice that undercut their ability to name and share their experiences, and this is to the benefit of one's engaging in harassment. So the issue of hermeneutical injustice is that there is no concept or way of talking about an issue that one faces that undermines one's ability to account for their own experience or to participate in society as an equal. So in this case, not being able to name the injustice of sexual harassment was to the detriment of the one being harassed and the benefit of the one doing the harassing. Now, different groups can have these hermeneutically disadvantaged states for all sorts of reasons. we live in a changing social world, and that frequently generates new sorts of experiences of which understanding can be drawn only gradually. Those that are a harm and are unfair, we can label as unjust. So when considering hermeneutical injustice, we have to think of the background social conditions that are conducive to this hermeneutical lacuna or blind spot is another word. Women's position at the time of second wave feminism, which these two examples are pulled from, was still marked by social powerlessness in relation to men. And these unequal relations made participating on equal terms with men in generating collective social meanings near impossible. So consider again the case of sexual harassment. This could be waived at the time as flirting, and even now as flirting, and the uneasy rejection by women is just lacking a sense of humor. That's what the hermeneutical resources were available at the time. So the unequal hermeneutical participation in producing the general social meanings is positively disguised by the existing meaning attributed to the behavior, making the practice difficult to see for what it is. When there's an unequal participation with respect to some significant social experience, those who disadvantaged are thereby hermeneutically marginalized. This is always socially coerced, and it's always a form of powerlessness. You're powerless to contribute to the collective understandings of shared experiences. It can sometimes be due to material power, or sometimes to be an effect of identity power, or it might be both. So what then is hermeneutical injustice? It's the injustice of having some significant area of one's social experience obscured from collective understanding owing to a structural identity prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resource. Okay, that's a lot of technical terms. So basically, someone lacks an understanding of their own social experience because they are denied access to constructing the social meanings that are relevant because of their identity. And why? Well, because there are structural barriers to their participation in making collective meanings. So again, you're a person, you want to account for your social experience, but you can't because you're denied access to the shared terms and understandings of social meanings about that experience. So it's not just that women didn't have a concept of sexual harassment. It's that women were not participants to the shared understanding of what sexual harassment should look like. And instead, this was dictated by the men at the time, and men just called it flirting, and it was a problem of women if they, couldn't deal with the humor of it, or couldn't take it as a compliment. So this is similar, or it speaks to the wrong of cultural imperialism discussed by Jung. You're making it so that people are represented by a dominant group, and the dominated group don't get a say in how to articulate their experiences. It's also the wrong of misrepresentation and lack of representation of trans women in the film and media that you see in Disclosure, the film I had you watch on Netflix. So an interesting thing about hermeneutical justice is that it's purely a structural notion. There is no culprit that's enacting it. The background condition for hermeneutical injustice is the subject's hermeneutical marginalization. But the moment of hermeneutical injustice comes only when the background condition is realized in a more or less doomed attempt on the part of the subject to render their experience intelligible to someone else. So it's revealed in cases where one is trying to make sense of their own experience. Now, this can compound with testimonial injustice. If someone tries to articulate their position, but they can't because they're lacking some kind of language to talk about their experience, another might then use this as a grounds to deflate their credibility. If this is partly due to some identity prejudice, then that someone is denied their status as a knower because of who they are and because of the hermeneutical injustice. So how is this a wrong? Hermeneutical injustice indicate a general or collective lack of knowledge about certain experiences, but these general lacks affect some more than others. She gives examples of how to think about this with dental coverage. Everyone might be formally equal under the policy that says you can get dental coverage if you can pay for it. So everyone has access to dental coverage if they can pay for it. But some people can't pay for it. And so the lack of dental coverage, the lack of a general policy of having dental coverage for everyone, only affects those who don't have dental coverage, and does not affect those who can afford to pay for their own. So similarly, everyone lacks, in the sexual harassment case, the understanding of what sexual harassment is, but it only affects those who are subject to detrimental behavior because it robs them specifically of the ability to account for their experience. So we can talk about situated hermeneutical inequalities. And this is a concrete case where the subject is unable to make communicatively intelligible something which is particularly in their interest to be able to render intelligible. So contrast this with what the men in the sexual harassment case can account for. For them, they're experiencing themselves just, say, flirting or being friendly. And they have access to resources to make that experience intelligible to them and to others. So they can easily negotiate or easily communicate that without having to appear foolish or silly or something. Whereas the women in the case were not experiencing it in that way, but lacked any kind of language to be able to account for what they were experiencing. And this is due to their exclusion from the pool of knowledge, owing to structural identity prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resource. So this failure is not only a harm in itself, but it can lead one to systematically doubt one's own experience or the ability to make sense of the world. And this can lead to a loss in epistemic confidence, where you can imagine that someone not sure of what their own experiences are, then defer to the already accepted hermeneutical standards, which in this case would be, like in our sexual harassment case, it would be women deferring to the way that men account for the circumstance and then internalize, it really must be a problem with me. But this can create a dissonance in the understanding of one's own identity, and one can struggle then with the dominant culture's interpretation of one's own experience and with one's own lived experience. I think we see that really nicely with the people who are talking about the media's influence on their own transition and the way that they understand their identity and disclosure. We also see an example from Fricker, from A Boy's Own Story, about how this plays out for Edmund White as a gay man. And you can see that story on 163. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail. But this is a particularly deep problem. The primary harm of hermeneutical injustice, then, is not only being unfairly disadvantaged, but also should be understood in terms of the construction of the way we understand ourselves. This can mean that someone develops into something they are not, and which it is against their interest to be. The wrong of testimonial injustice is inflicted individual to individual, but the hermeneutical injustice is caused by a feature of the collective hermeneutical resource that we share as members of a society. Okay, so if this is wrong, then what do we need to do as hearers who are committed to justice or committed to the dismantling of oppressive structures? Well, Fricker thinks that the virtue here is a corrective virtue. It requires an alertness or sensitivity to the possibility that the difficulty that one's interlocutor is having as they try to render something communicatively intelligible is not due to its being nonsense or to that person being a fool, but rather some sort of gap in collective hermeneutical resources. So the point's to realize that the speaker is struggling with an objective difficulty and it's not a subjective failing. When we're listening to someone, particularly from a marginalized community or with a social identity that is consistently marginalized or the subject to stereotypes and oppression and prejudice, we should give them the benefit of the doubt. We should think of what they're saying as having like the difficulties that they might have in expressing their circumstances as one that's not due to their own individual failing, but a failing of ours as a society to allow people like that to participate in constructing our shared understandings of social experience. So when engaging with those who are subjects of identity prejudice, we ought to adjust or correct our initial credibility judgments. So where possible, we ought to achieve a credibility judgment that reflects the degree to which the interpretation the speaker is struggling to articulate would make good sense if the attempt to articulate it were made under better circumstances, made in a more inclusive hermeneutical climate, one without structural identity prejudice. So it might be rational, for example, for men to adopt a kind of epistemic affirmative action. Adopt the working hypothesis that when a woman or any member of a stereotyped group says something anomalous from their own perspective, so anomalous from the perspective of a man, well, the man should assume that it's they who don't understand, and not that the woman or the marginalized member is misrepresenting something or somehow getting it wrong. The immediate end or goal of the virtuous here is to neutralize the impact of structural identity prejudice on one's judgment that the person you're talking with, your interlocutor, is credible. This ultimately aims at the elimination of the injustice that it's designed to correct for. So remember that the ultimate injustice is down to the way that the hermeneutical landscape is built and how it systematically sets aside or does not include particular communities. So we ultimately want to eliminate that problem. But this hermeneutical marginalization is generally due to unequal relations of social power more generally. So this can't just happen. We can't get this good outcome just by listening better and compensating for deflations of credibility. We have to also shift unequal relations of power so that these conditions don't arise in the first place. And what's really interesting about this account is that we have not only a moral, which we might expect, a moral duty to end oppression, but we also have an epistemic duty to enact social justice. So it's our responsibility as moral agents and as knowers, as those committed to truth and knowledge.